All right, everybody. Hello, my name is Clayton Taylor, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about the Afghanistan withdrawal and kind of our threats in the U.S.-Mexico border and some of the things that I see. But before we do that, I think it's only proper that I kind of introduce myself. I'm going to share my desktop here, and I'm going to kind of just downplay my face here in the corner so that you can kind of see me. But a little bit of a background: I joined the military in 2006, where I went to the 101st. I went to a Scout Sniper platoon there and deployed with Tiger Force Recon to Iraq for 15 months. Got out in '09, and then I went and got my bachelor's degree in security management from AMU, and then I re-entered the service in 2013, wound up in Ranger Regiment, where I deployed to Afghanistan in 2015. With them. And this is a helocast out at Tybee. It's a good day. And that's at the Ranger Ball with my wife. And so before I get into that, after I left in 2018, the military for the final time, I got picked up as an OGA contractor where I work for a private military company. You may be familiar with that. I'll let you search it out on your own. And then I deployed significantly with them for over a period of 6 years. And so I've spent a significant amount of time to the Middle East with military background in both the public and the private sector. And so I have a lot of people have asked me over the years, they're like, hey, what is your take on everything that's going on in the Middle East as opposed to what's happening in the media? And I'll just jump to this. Because most people by now, they know that the media is owned by just a handful of companies, and 6 companies will basically dominate our entire media sphere. If I can get that box to go away, that'd be great. And so these 6 companies own everything. And so most people know that there is an extreme bias in our news outlets, and they don't know what to believe. And it doesn't matter what side you're on, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you're fed a bias to whatever team you're on. And what I will say, having served under both administrations in both the public and the private sector, I will say that 2 wings, the left and right wing, are attached to the same bird. Okay, it's all one, and you'll find that a lot of the times most are kind of in bed together, but we've become increasingly polarized as a nation, and really I just kind of want to, everybody kind of wants to be able to like sift through the nonsense, right? How do we make sense of everything around us? And so I'm simply just going to bring up some facts. I'm going to use open source intelligence to do this. So I don't compromise any like non-disclosure agreements or anything like that. But there are times that I look at the news and I'm like, wow, they've got it right. And there's other times where I'm like, oh, that is completely incorrect. And so I hope to kind of shed some light as to be like the things that we should be paying attention to more, that is either not being brought to attention by the media, or is downplayed, or maybe brought up briefly and then it's quickly shuffled away, and then we focus on these other distractions. And so I'm going to bring up some things that I think is some pretty critical threats that we should be paying attention to, and just some overall observations. And so I'm just going to bring up some facts and just a little bit of like my take on it. And I leave this for you to really search out on your own and come to your own conclusions. I happen to believe that I'm right, of course. But again, I kind of want to get people to come to their own, do the research and come to your own conclusions, and do not solely rely on these companies to be feeding you information at all. So that being said, I also hold a master's in Homeland Security from AMU and a second master's in Christian Studies from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Okay, and so the purpose here is to give a view of international politics, but also from an American Christian standpoint. I'm going to end it with my Christian notes here. All right, so let's just move forward here. And we'll talk, not only does these 6 companies own the media, but we also know that large corporations will also own a majority of the products that we see on the shelves as well. And most of these toe the line with the government and this big money to some way. And there's a big government influence here. We definitely saw that with COVID and the lockdowns and the crushing of small and medium-sized businesses as well. And so I don't have any affiliations with anybody. I don't care whose feelings I hurt. I just kind of call it how I see it. And so I'm just going to bring it up here. We're going to talk about the Afghanistan withdrawal. And we're all pretty familiar with that. It's a lot of us are very upset of it, and we're trying to make sense of what really happened. And so I'm just going to kind of go just a little bit through it here. The U.S. completed their withdrawal from Afghanistan on August 30th, 2021. And that officially ended the 20-year war that began back in 2001. It started after 9/11, right? And so it really all started back in February 2020 when the Trump administration and the Taliban reached this agreement in Doha, Qatar. That deal laid out certain restrictions for both sides. The U.S. and Taliban had to pull back on the fighting, and in return, the Taliban was committed to counterterrorism efforts. The end game of that deal was the complete withdrawal of NATO forces by May 1st, 2021. As soon as that deal was signed, the U.S. drastically reduced their air support for the Afghan National Security Forces, the ANSF, which left the ANSF hanging in their fight against the Taliban insurgency. All right. Now, if we fast forward to April 2021, the Biden administration made the final decision to begin pulling troops out on May 1st, but the complete withdrawal was delayed until September. And that delay played a major role in the collapse of the Afghan National Security Force, that ANSF, eventually leading to the Taliban's takeover of Kabul in August 15. And we're going to get to that mess, right? This is what everybody remembers. And I'll leave the timeline on the screen so you can walk through it with me here. And so under the Trump administration's agreement, and again, I'm not going to call political sides one way or the other here. I'm just reading through the facts. The Trump administration's agreement, U.S. forces were to be cut down from 13,000 to 8,600 troops by July 2020. If the Taliban held up their end of the deal, then a complete withdrawal was to happen on May 1st. But when Biden took office, about 2,500 U.S. troops remained in Afghanistan. In April, he announced that the withdrawal wouldn't start before May 1st, but would be completed by September 11, 9/11, as a symbolic date, right? 9/11, 9/11 caused us to be here. We're going to leave on 9/11. Right? But in the May 1st, the Taliban already begun their final offensive. And in July, Biden pushed up the deadline to August 31st. And by early August, around 650 U.S. troops were left in Afghanistan, mainly securing the Kabul airport and the U.S. embassy. NATO's Resolute Support mission ended on July 12th, and the intelligence assessments up until that point still thought that Kabul was not going to fall for a few months or weeks post-withdrawal. But as we know, everything unraveled quite quickly, horribly. And so during that time, the U.S. launched this Operation Allies Refuge. And it was an effort to evacuate American translators, more on this later, and select Afghan citizens considered at risk. My personal take is we shouldn't have brought back any of them back to the United States. The same country that burned through billions of our dollars and had no trouble shooting some of our troops in the back. And so, anyway, I don't think we should have brought any of them back. But there was a decision to bring some of these guys back into the United States. More on this later. Again, I want to show you. It probably painted a really nice picture at the time, and there was documentaries like Send Me made about this. We really care about these guys. But I'm going to show you the real threat to this. And so, to handle the evacuation of American personnel and Afghan allies, this new command, U.S. Forces Afghanistan Forward, was established on July the 7th. Then, as the Taliban continued their sweep across the country on August the 12th, Biden deployed 3,000 U.S. troops to secure the Kabul airport for the evacuation of embassy personnel, U.S. citizens, and the special immigrant visa applicants. On August the 14th, with the Taliban's swift advance, the number of troops was bumped up to 5,000. The fall of Kabul happened on August the 15th, and an additional 2,000 troops were sent, totaling 7,000 troops on the ground. By August the 30th at 11:59 p.m. Kabul time, the last U.S. military planes lifted off from the Kabul airport, making the end of the withdrawal. And we remember that horrific scene, right? Absolutely terrible. All right. And so, however, even after that withdrawal, there was around 1,000 Americans and Afghans that were holding U.S. or these other visas that were left stranded, held up by the Taliban. The U.S. government wasn't authorizing their departure, leading to a lot of chaos and criticism. Then in late September, get this, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, General Mark Milley, and CENTCOM Commander Jen Frank McKenzie all testified before Congress denying President Biden's claim that the withdrawal was based on military advice. Interesting. More on this in a minute. And you're going to start to connect the pieces as I go through this. Instead, they confirmed that they actually advised keeping some troops in Afghanistan, contradicting what had been previously stated by the administration. And so what was the result of this fiasco? Well, I'll tell you, right? Because shortly after that, we start seeing the Taliban proper parading around with U.S. Special Operations equipment, right? The botched withdrawal didn't just leave Afghanistan in chaos. It massively armed the Taliban with this massive stockpile of U.S. military equipment, billions of dollars worth of weapons, vehicles, helicopters, drones, and all this was left behind, effectively falling into Taliban hands on purpose. This administration purposely armed them, and I'm going to get to this. Everything from Humvees to MRAPs, right? Humvees, MRAPs as they paraded around, to rifles, night vision gear ended up in their arsenal, and it instantly made them one of the most well-equipped militant groups in the region. Essentially, the Taliban, these people that we've been fighting for 20 years, was handed an arsenal that we had built up over 2 decades. And now they used it to maintain power, oppress the Afghan people, and bolster their military capabilities. Now, anybody in the military knows that when there is a burnout, and I've done this in other countries, and I won't get into that here, but you usually thermite all your equipment. Why? So that an enemy actor cannot gain access to or benefit from or use or steal or copy. But it was so quick and rapid, it makes us wonder, why was it handled the way that it was? And it's because it actively armed the Taliban, who went and paraded around in the streets with it. And so, meanwhile, the U.S. scrambled to evacuate not only its citizens, but also thousands of these Afghan nationals. Now, while many of these individuals were allies or those at risk due to their association with the American forces, it has to be said that the vetting process was chaotic, to say the least, or non-existent. People were rushed through checkpoints and onto planes without thorough background checks. Many of these Afghan evacuees were then brought into the U.S. under the label of refugees, creating a massive security concern because of the speed and lack of proper vetting during the evacuation. Again, I've never been a proponent of allowing any of them to come back into the United States at all. It was their country. We were there to build them up to fight for their own country, and they let that falter. And they had no issues either taking us out or blowing through our money and taking an easy handout. And so the ripple effect does not stop there. The Taliban is not just sitting around running the country. They're training terrorists to exploit weaknesses in our own security, particularly along the southern border. And this is all, you can research all of this open source as well. And so with the current lack of enforcement at our borders and this near open door policy in some of the areas where the gates are literally just left open, in some cases where the Border Patrol is actively busing migrants in. They have their hand in, actually just come on over. Blows my mind. And so the Taliban is now facilitating the movement of trained fighters to try to sneak into the United States. This is happening. It's already happened, technically speaking. And so making this border crisis not just an immigration issue, it is a huge national security risk. And there will be hell to pay for it. Mark my words. It's not a matter of if it will happen, it is a matter of when. To make matters even worse, the Biden and Harris administration has reportedly provided over $200 million to the Taliban. All right. And so after they parade all this around, and look at this. U.S. taxpayers may be funding the Taliban and Afghan terror groups. You can read all this stuff up for yourself. And so this funding is usually framed as humanitarian aid, but let's be quite real here. It's effectively propping up a terrorist-led regime that openly opposes U.S. interests. So not only did we give them armament, but we gave them direct U.S. taxpayer-funded money in hundreds of millions of dollars. And look at what we're spending on Ukraine and everything. And I'll make a totally separate video on Ukraine and Russia here in a little bit. That will probably blow your mind. And so, or maybe not. Who knows? And so this administration, our government here, has propped up this terrorist-led regime that we've been fighting that openly opposes U.S. interests. And these funds are meant to support the Afghan people, but obviously under Taliban rule, they're not. We can't play ignorant here. Nobody in Washington is like, oh, we had no idea this would happen. They're briefed well above the American public, and they're privy to a lot more. We've been at it for a long time. We know exactly what's going on. Because under Taliban rule, it's very highly likely, 100% likely, that a significant, if not all, portion of is being redirected to support their own Taliban operations and consolidate their power. Definitely. So the end result is that we've armed our adversaries. And we brought in potentially unvetted individuals and are now giving millions to a regime that is actively undermining U.S. security and interest. And when you look at who is doing what is happening and who is the proponent of this, it is quite alarming. And so all while our southern border is left vulnerable to the very threats that we supposedly fought against for 20 years. And so it's a dangerous cocktail that could have long-lasting consequences, and it will. For our national security and our global standing. And so then we have to ask ourselves here, after all of this, who really is in charge? Let's switch now over. Who's in charge of our southern border? And I don't want to just pick on the administration. I want to look at everybody, like just fact-wise, who do we have that's running this country that is looking at the border? And so politically, the U.S. southern border with Mexico is overseen by several key entities. One, at the federal level, is the Department of Homeland Security. This department, which is led by the Secretary of Homeland Security, is responsible for overall border security and policy. The DHS oversees key agencies like the U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, right? CBP and ICE. And so the CBP, which includes the Border Patrol, handles the protection and security of the border, including preventing illegal crossings and overseeing the ports of entry. And then you have the ICE, and then you have the presidential and the executive branch. Ultimately, border policies and enforcement are directed by the president and the administration in power. Currently, under the Biden administration, these policies reflect the priorities that's set by President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, who has been designated as the point person for addressing immigration issues and the root causes of that migration. Then you have, on top of that, the DOJ, who handles immigration courts and legal issues relating to the border through agencies like the Executive Office for Immigration Review. And then we have the state level. And so you have governors of the border states like Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California have their own roles in border security, with these governors that are able to direct state resources such as the National Guard to assist with the border control and other security issues. For example, Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who I have here on the screen, has actively used state resources to address border security, setting up his own state-run initiatives like Operation Lone Star. And so in short, while the federal government is primarily in charge of border security and policy through the DHS, state leaders also play a significant role in responding to these issues on the ground. And so the president and the DHS lead at a national level, but the governors and the state agencies have the power to supplement these efforts and influence how border security is managed locally. All right, now that we have that ironed out of the way. And so let's look a little bit at a breakdown. We can obviously see, while Trump didn't completely squash our illegal immigration and most deportations happened under the Obama administration, we can see clearly that from really early 2020, and we start seeing a spike upwards all the way to 21. We had your cerveza sickness, your COVID sickness. and the lockdowns, and then we have this explosion. And there's no look at any of the statistics. This administration, the last 3.5 years, we've seen an explosion in just an open border. And you can't deny the statistics. You can look up any chart and see that in the last 3.5 years it's just skyrocketed. And so let's look at what is the common threats at the border. Okay, number one, right off the bat, is we have illegal immigration and human smuggling. Unauthorized crossings. These are individuals that are entering the U.S. illegally. In the fiscal year of 2021, the Border Protection reported over 1.7 million encounters. That was the highest number in decades. In 2020, during the COVID pandemic, encounters were lower at about 458,000. Human smuggling. Smugglers known as coyotes transport people illegally across the border, often exploiting vulnerable migrants for financial gain. We know this. And so a 2021 Border Protection report noted an increase in smuggling operations, with traffickers charging $4,000 to $20,000 per person. The second threat that we have here is drug trafficking. The border is a significant entry point for narcotics, including fentanyl, heroin, meth, cocaine. Fentanyl, over 14,000 pounds, was seized by the Border Patrol in 2021. That's up from 4,700 pounds in 2020. This is a highly potent synthetic opioid that is active at the microgram level. I mean, you only need a speck of it touch your skin, and it'll kill you. And it's a highly potent opioid that's responsible for a growing number of overdose deaths in the United States. A lot of it is synthesized either down in labs in Mexico, but also in China as well. Has their big say so as well. They have a bunch of labs that synthesize a lot of fentanyl as well. Comes right through our border. Methamphetamine, around 192,000 pounds were seized in 21. That's up from 177,000 pounds. In 2020, cocaine, 97,000 pounds were seized in 2021. We would also note that compared to Pablo Escobar, cocaine has dramatically, we've added all these security measures across, and we have all this, these seizures, but actually cocaine entering the United States has skyrocketed since the days of Pablo Escobar and the Cali cartel. That's fascinating, but you don't really hear so much about it anymore. Why? Well, they're under a certain thumb that's controlling it, because it's money that's non-tapped. Whose thumb is it? I'll let you come to your own conclusions. And so the drug cartels are heavily involved in trafficking, controlling smuggling routes and using tactics like tunnels, drones, hidden compartments to transport drugs across the border. All right. And then, let's see here. Then we have special interest aliens. All right, this is really what I wanted to draw back also from the Afghan withdrawal, and so I'm going to make this as an interesting tidbit here as well. And again, this is open source information, and so this is like the number 3 known threat to our border. And so these terrorism concerns and special interest aliens. And what is this special interest alien? These are migrants from countries with known terrorist activity or other security risks. Afghanistan included here, with a lot of them coming from Afghanistan here on the screen, as you can see. In fiscal year 2021, they saw over 3,000 special interest aliens apprehended at the southern border in 1 year. Terrorism watch list encounters. These are encounters of individuals on the terrorist screening database that have increased. 2021 recorded 15 known or suspected terrorists apprehended at the southern border. We don't know how many got through. This number, although is small, raises concerns due to the potential for such individuals to exploit vulnerabilities in the border security system. And again, we'll go back to human trafficking and exploitation. Migrants, particularly women and children, are often vulnerable to human trafficking. According to the DHS, in 2020, there was 1,600 investigations into human trafficking-related crimes, women and children being sold as sex slaves. Unaccompanied minors, there was a huge surge in unaccompanied minors crossing the border in 21, with 144,000 children encountered by Customs and Border Patrol, which doubled the 2019 numbers. Then we have weapons smuggling. Now, these are weapons that, before people come in and talk about gun control and want to freak out, these are the weapons that your background checks don't do jack squat about. These are the ones that are off the record, off the market, that people get to just, they're like drop weapons to execute and then drop. The serial number has no ties. It wouldn't matter anyway. So these are black market weapons. And so, but remember what administration did a ATF drug running? What was it? The Fast and Furious? Fascinating. That was under the Obama administration. But look at this. The border serves as a transit route for smuggled firearms, often flowing from the U.S. To Mexican cartels. The ATF, or the ATFE, if you want to throw in the explosives at the end, indicated that about 70% of firearms recovered in Mexico between 2014 and 2019 were traced back to the U.S. Gang activity. This is stuff like MS-13. They're involved in cross-border criminal activity, including drug trafficking, human smuggling, and violence. Both the FBI and the DHS have both cited an increase in gang-related crimes tied to cross-border smuggling operations. And then, again, to reach back to the Afghanistan and the domestic threats here, is the economic impact and fraud. Fake IDs and these fraudulent asylum claims. Okay. Some individuals use these fraudulent documents or asylum claims to enter the U.S. illegally. And in 2021, the Border Patrol seized over 35,000 fake IDs at the border. That is an insane amount, people. We cannot just turn a blind eye to this. This has been happening. And you see the uptick. You look at Colorado, you see the uptick in gang-related violence or migrant violence in the U.S. The threat is already here. We've sat back and tolerated it for years and years and years, and people have sat back and back and back. And so I want to go back and talk about really the Taliban again. All right, and so here we see the Taliban clearly here with special operations equipment, and these are one of their training camps as well. They hire youth like most groups do, kids, and put them to work. And so I just want to go over some of the key characteristics. For people that are unfamiliar with the Taliban, I think it's good to just hit the basics of what they're really known for. Because some people hear, Taliban just bad. Okay, terrorists bad. But let's look at what they're really known for. And when we look at the fact that our administration just gave 2 decades worth of military equipment over to this group and hundreds of millions of dollars, we need to understand what our administration is actively propping up and supporting and what this represents. And so number one is Islamic extremism and Sharia law, right? These Taliban is known for several key characteristics. This is one of them. They have a strict interpretation of Islam. The Taliban follows a fundamentalist interpretation of Sunni Islam and imposes strict Sharia law, which includes harsh punishments like amputations, public executions, and floggings. They're well known for their oppression of women and girls. I don't see any feminist standing up for the oppression of women or girls that are happening out there right now at all, that are currently even left swinging. Where are you? Where is your anger at what is happening here? Because under the Taliban rule, of which this administration has propped up greatly, women are often denied very basic rights, including education, employment, and freedom of movement. They must adhere to strict dress codes and are generally not allowed to leave their homes without a male escort. Two, the Taliban is known for its militancy and guerrilla warfare. It's known for its long-running insurgency against the U.S. and NATO forces, as well as against the Afghan government, utilizing guerrilla tactics and improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, suicide bombings, and assassinations, of which we have dealt with for the last 20 years. And so while they're ill-equipped, they are sneaky. And so conflict and violence, they're known for that. They're engaged in brutal warfare, including targeting civilians, government officials, and security forces throughout Afghanistan. There is a support for terrorism. You'll note they have been known for harboring al-Qaeda. The Taliban has provided safe haven to Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda leading up to the 9/11 attacks. Okay? The refusal to hand over bin Laden was the primary reason for the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. They have links with other terror groups as well, and this is well known, right? The Taliban maintains ties with various militant groups, including the Haqqani Network and other jihadist organizations operating in the region. And of course, they've gone through a number of regimes. They're known for their narcotics and opium production. Afghanistan in itself is a major producer of opium, and the Taliban has long profited from that drug trade, as a lot of narco-terrorism will. It's just a lot of quick, fast money that's off the books. And so while they have at times claimed to oppose drug production, they have also taxed and facilitated it as a major source of income. They're known for human rights violations and war crimes, for like extrajudicial killings and torture. The Taliban is known for carrying out brutal forms of punishment, including summary executions of perceived enemies, or ethnic cleansing, torture, and hostage taking. They target journalists, activists, and ethnic minorities. The group has targeted those it views as opponents, including journalists, human rights activists, religious minorities, especially Shia Hazara, and former government workers. They have an enforcement of traditional and cultural norms. The Taliban prohibits music, dancing, television, films, many forms of entertainment considered un-Islamic under the strict interpretation. They're known for destroying pre-Islamic cultural sites, most notably the Buddhas of Bamiyan in 2001, which were ancient statues carved into cliffs. And then they're known for their control of territory and parallel government. So the Taliban has established parallel governance structures in the areas that it controls, including courts, taxation, social services, often providing some semblance of stability in the areas neglected by the Afghan government. And beyond the opium trade, the Taliban has been known to generate income through taxes on agriculture, mining, and local businesses within their controlled territories. And of course, obviously, their hostility towards Western influence and intervention is the icing on the cake there. They have a ton of anti-Western rhetoric, which is interesting because, again, prop them up with a huge military armament and hundreds of millions of dollars. Why would we do that when we could have effectively thermited and destroyed all of ourselves and done a control pullout? And again, I would say it wasn't just that it was sloppy, is that it was quite premeditated. They're not fools about it. This is all done intentionally. You don't just it's one thing to say, we pulled out too quick and left all of our stuff behind, but then to subsequently fund with hundreds of millions of taxpayer funded, dollar bills, then you start to be like, this is interesting. And then when you make the connection with the U.S. southern border and the fact that, our government needs domestic issues to stay relevant in wars and whatnot, it really starts to pique your interest as to wait a minute, who's on the side of the American people here, right? You start to piece these things together. And so the Taliban opposes Western cultural and political influence, particularly the U.S. NATO presence in Afghanistan, which it views as foreign occupation, of which we left. The Taliban rejects democratic governance. It advocates for an Islamic emirate ruled by its interpretation of Sharia law. And so anyway, that's kind of just a little bit of a background on what we're dealing with over there, and that botched withdrawal. And so when we flip back to the U.S. and we see what is the DHS and the FBI saying, well, it's interesting because the DHS is seeing a high risk of foreign and domestic terrorism in the Homeland Threat Assessment. Okay, and so this is one of these reports from the DHS that comes out that really talks about the most pressing threats to the United States. And so here in this article, it'll say this annual Homeland Threat Assessment is going to serve as a primary mechanism for sharing the terrorism threat level, which has previously been done from the National Terrorism Advisory System. And so let's look at what they have to say. And it's interesting because from this assessment that they made, and I'll downsize myself here, is that when we look at this, we see that they identify that the department expects the threat of violence from individuals radicalized in the United States to remain high but largely unchanged, mainly seen through lone offenders or small group attacks that occur with very little warning. While sustained counterterrorism pressure has significantly degraded the ability of foreign terrorist organizations to target U.S. interests, foreign terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS are seeking to rebuild overseas, and they maintain worldwide networks of supporters that could seek to target the homeland. Okay? Do you see the connection between lone threat actors and domestic threats and what's happening here and what we're propping up? Where do you think these people train at before they come through the southern border? Okay. And again, FBI, DHS leaders warn of substantial risks. This is back in 2022, risk of targeted violence. And again, lone wolf actors pose greatest domestic terror threat, the FBI and the DHS conclude. And I'll talk about a little bit what I've seen, at least on a professional level as well. And again, FBI director is saying that here back in 23, they keep bringing up this increased terrorist threat. We're in this dangerous period of time of what? And it's also, you look for this pressure because we're seeing a lot of action right now happening between Israel and all the Muslims, or really Islam in the Middle East, particularly with Iran and all of its militant groups operating in the region. And so, because of Israel and Hamas, has led to a spike of threats against the United States. Why? Well, largely it's because that if terrorist groups target the U.S., then the idea is that it will pressure the United States into either taking hands off Israel or pressing us into action. Very similar to what 9/11 did, was kind of forced our hand into a long-scale war. That was his plan, Osama bin Laden's plan, and it worked. And a lot of time, what they try to do is force our hand politically. And there's a delicate balance going back and forth with that. But you can see here, clearly there is an uptick in domestic threats in the United States. And here again, we see it, the Israel-Gaza conflict being used as extremist propaganda. And they said they've seen it from Al-Qaeda affiliates, almost every single one of them. Seen it from ISIS, which isn't even ideologically aligned with a group like Hamas, but is still leveraging its current conflict to try to sow a kind of violence, bring adherence to this kind of exploitive way. And so again, they say on the home front, Ray is saying that the biggest concern for the FBI is that violent extremists, including people that are inspired by foreign terrorist groups or people that come through our southern border, that come from these areas, that it will become these domestic violent extremists, will draw inspiration from an ongoing conflict to carry out attacks against Americans. This is only a matter of time. This will happen. And they've said they've already seen it, where they've caught some of these onesies and twosies, where they say here, like they saw it with the individual that they arrested last week in Houston, who'd been studying how to build bombs and posted online about his support for killing Jews, and with the tragic killing of a 6-year-old Muslim boy in Illinois that we're investigating at a federal hate crime. But he goes on to say that he's also concerned about traditional former terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Hezbollah potentially carrying out strikes inside the United States. How are they going to do that? From our southern border. Interesting, which is open, quite open. I mean, there's even been videos of the Border Patrol busing these people in. Under what administration? Okay? Do you start to piece the puzzle together here? And so we have this credible threat from a foreign terrorist organization, and a structured attack here or something like that. And what is the major thing that we see is that we see that a lot of times, and I'm just speaking professionally here in my study, just as a background, a bachelor's in security management, master's in homeland security, and what I've seen pouring through all the statistics and the issues is that when it comes to dismantling things like extremist cults, both left and right wing, however flavor you want to have it, any dangerous group really that wants to bring any form of hurt against the general population to achieve this political shift, terrorism. And what they see is that lone wolf actors pose some of the greatest threats. This is repeated over and over. This is why we have such an issue with these school shooters, is that a lot of them are just little onesies and twosies that are radicalized and they spiral off. Well, a lot of these that have been happening all over, these little mass little shootings, these little lone wolf acting. Imagine if you were to have a coordinated lone wolf attack, so to speak. If a lot of people with no, basically a lot like October the 7th happened with Israel, without any prior knowledge or any prior surveillance or anything like that, to launch in, and your objective is to take out as many people as possible. And so we have all these people that have came through, and all they need is a direction to be like, hey, this is it. Here's where you're going to go. Do your damage. And it'll just be sporadic. There was no trace to get them. There's no, since everything is owned by all these companies and ultimately the government, there's really no way to get a hold of these guys. And so therefore, we have this ginormous threat domestically to the U.S. And nobody's really talking about it. Or if they are, it's really being downplayed, or it's just kind of on the back burner. And I think it's very concerning. And then again, here we go. Iran and its proxies from another article. The U.S. has no intelligence that indicates Iran or its proxies, most notably the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah, had any foreknowledge of the Hamas 7th attack. And so I think what has happened over the last 20 years, particularly with lone wolf actors, even when you have the Boston bombing, is that this has all been watched and monitored, and basically data has been collected to see what has been successful and what hasn't. And all you have to do is take what is successful and then beef it up. I mean, look at what has happened with drone warfare to Ukraine. And I'm going to do a whole nother thing on Ukraine later. But they've taken these 3D printed FPV drones that are now taking out boats, helicopters, tanks. It's totally revolutionized warfare as we know it. Now imagine if you have those, that are either on like tow cable line with fiber optic line, which they've already started to do that, where you can't even jam them. Or you have multiple drone attacks where you can't, there's no defense against this kind of stuff. So what do you do? You know what I mean? And this is really the bleeding edge of warfare as we see it today, is constantly finding out what works, what you can get away, what are the loopholes currently in the system that can be exploited or expanded upon. And so we have to stay vigilant is my point. It's not to be like fear-inducing by any means, but it's really just to get people to say, hey, we need to understand what side is the government on in all of this. Does this administration have my best interest at mind? And I've served both sides honorably, and I'm mad at both sides for various reasons. And it saddens me to see the state of a country that I have, that a lot of my friends have died for, and to see it fall into the state that we're in today. I mean, it makes me torn up inside, and I know a lot of my brothers in service feel the same way. It's a country that you were really once proud of. It's just disintegrated, and we've become quite divided, and it's heartbreaking. Because I remember back post 9/11 of how united we were. Everybody was flying American. It didn't matter what side you were on. It was just everybody was happy to be an American. And now it seems today is that we have the exact opposite. People just, it's almost like shameful. People hate their country. But I'm telling you right now, the tolerance for the nonsense and the sitting back and doing nothing has it's there's going to be hell to pay. It's only a matter of time. America, ultimately, any veteran will tell you that America sits in a bubble of this protection where we think nothing bad happens here aside from the occasional school shooting or natural disaster. But aside from that, most people feel like they're in this bubble, that nothing can ever happen here, and they're just obsessed with the next sports game or the next thing or their 80-hour work week or just trying to afford groceries or whatever. But most people are in this bubble. It's the next TV show, it's the next video game, it's the next thing. But I think that things are being set up here on the back burner here that we need to pay attention to for sure. And I bring it up because I just don't see, maybe people don't care about it so much, and that's fine. But I feel like it's my duty to at least bring it up to be like, hey, here's something we should be paying attention to. And so I'm going to end it with this, right? Because I run a Christian ministry here and teach the Bible. And so where do we play in all this? And ultimately, you will find, prophetically, I'll say as a Christian, is that America is nowhere in prophecy. Absolutely nowhere. We have no guarantees as per the Bible at all. The only thing that America has going for it is the Abrahamic covenant, where God says to Abraham, I will bless them that bless thee, and I will curse them that curses thee, and in thee will all the families in the world be blessed. And so America right now, biblically speaking, the only thing we have going for us is our support for Israel. But if actors, both domestically and internationally, dissolve us or balkanize us or what have you, then it will diminish that support ultimately for Israel, who is surrounded on all sides right now. It's not about whether or not Israel is good or bad. It's the fact that God has his glory upon it. God has his name on the lease. The Bible clearly says that Israel is very difficult, and even the Torah says stiff-necked. There's no surprise with that. But God's glory is on the line. And so my concern is, as a Christian, is that the moment America, either politically or because we dissolve, takes our hand off and we start to say no to Israel, and I know this will be highly controversial, and I don't care, is that then I would start to biblically worry for America. But aside from that, that's all America has going for it, is the Abrahamic covenant. And so where does the Christian come in all of this? Because you hear a lot of Christians today, well, it doesn't really matter. We're going to be out of here anyway. Maybe the rapture is going to happen. Well, we can't just give up as a Christian. And we have to, voting season is coming. And we need to vote appropriately, one that's based off of Christian values. Acts 17:30 says that all people everywhere, right? In times past, God overlooked ignorance, but now he requires all people to repent. And so that really depends on, that's all Christians as well. Repent from what? Repent from sin, period. You cannot just rip that out of your Bible and all the other, and James as well. And Romans 13 poses a conundrum to us, because Romans 13 will say, be submissive to the government. And Paul was writing when Nero was in power. So what do we do with that? Because we live in a democratic republic, and so our representatives are supposed to represent the will of the people. And so what happens when that doesn't happen anymore? We are supposed to legally represent ourselves. So my call for the Christian is that do not sit on your couch during this election season and do absolutely nothing. You have a God-appointed duty to take action, at least through the voting mechanism, to vote correctly for a party that has America's interest at heart. All right, I know it may not be politically correct. I know I'm going to get a lot of backlash for it, but I don't care. That's fine. I totally expect that because the Bible tells me I'm going to get that, and that's fine. And so anyway, I just want to leave that with you guys just as a little insight, and I'll let you guys do an Acts 17:11, right? Take the Berean challenge. Take all of this, right? The Berean challenge was that the Bereans are more noble than those in Thessalonica, and that they received the word with all readiness of mind, but then they searched the scriptures daily to see whether it was so. And so both the information I've laid out for you, plus Bible references, I say don't just take my word for it. I want you to get in, research it, and see it for yourself and come to your own conclusions. That's all I ask. And that's it. I hope you guys have a good one, and then I will create some more videos here in the future about my stance on Ukraine and Russia, and then one on China as well, and then one on, I probably could do one on COVID, China, and then the U.S. manufacturing as well. But anyway, more on that to follow. Thank you guys for joining me.